What an esteemed group of people on stage right now. It's extraordinary, and I want to thank you all for joining us. I'm truly humbled because the people on stage truly represent the fabric and fortitude of Atlanta. Ambassador Young needs no introduction. Congressman, ambassador, mayor, philanthropist, you've been instrumental in making Atlanta a global city. You've been advocating for innovation, infrastructure, inclusion. Dr. Bernice King, you've been carrying the legacy of your mother and father, Coretta and Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. You've been advocating for dignity and equity for decades. And of course, Mayor Bottoms, we're thrilled to have you here. Your leadership has been profound, and we're grateful for your 21st century vision of Atlanta and one that's centered on equity and inclusion. I want to talk about building compassionate cities, and it's incredibly personal to me because a decade ago, I worked on helping to secure a commutation from President Bush for a client I had been representing who was serving a 14-year federal prison sentence for a first-time nonviolent drug offense. And in the process, I truly learned how uncompassionate our cities can be. And that's really informed how we are looking to define smart cities. What is the term smart? And we need to make sure that equity, prosperity, humanity, inclusion are part of the new smart city. So compassion has never been more relevant than it is now. Gun violence is ravaging our communities, and this very talk is taking place on 9/11. So I want to talk about where are we? How did we get here? Are we more or less compassionate of a city now than we've been in the past? And I'd love to hear your perspective on, has technology caused us to be closer or more divisive? And please start with any way that you'd want to.
I'm going to defer to Ambassador Young.
Well, let me say that I started out thinking that this is a smart city. And it's been a smart city since the 40s. Because in almost every generation, there's been a dreamer to do something that seemed stupid and impossible at the time. Starting with Mayor Hartsfield, who brought Delta here from North Louisiana and gave them all the land they wanted to $1 a year for 50 years to get this airport started. He lost the election because the city wasn't ready for that vision. But now, looking back, with Delta employing over 100,000 people in this neighborhood, and it is the busiest airport in the world. But it goes back to that early dream. I won't say anything more about Bernice's family dream, because it wasn't just her daddy's dream, it was her mama's dream too. And then my mayor has been on the edge of creativity in everything she's been doing. So I think I don't think there's anything wrong with this city. It just takes a little time to grow. And we're changing so fast that we have to catch up with ourselves. But in every generation, her father came along, the family came here in the 60s, and that changed the whole world. In the 70s, we got into mass transit, politics, and ended up, Jimmy Carter came out of this neighborhood. And in the 80s, we decided that we were going to be an international city. And people thought that was crazy. And yet we started building the world's busiest airport. In the 90s, Billy Payne and others dreamed up the Olympics. And I guess at the turn of the century, these two young women have just, well, Bernice did something revolutionary that I think is the basis of being a smart city, and that is she went to a middle school of girls and got them to commit to 100 days of nonviolence, and changed one of the roughest schools in the world to almost, they weren't quite angels, but with a little more help, they could have been. And so this city is always way ahead. Now, I'm not sure what the mayor's plans are, but a $5 billion project in the middle of the city was her starting point. And that will revolutionize the whole South. We're looking now at 2004, where people have decided that we're looking toward, we were a city too busy to hate in the 60s. And we're looking at becoming a peace city, just as a brand. Now, to me, that's just the foundation. But I think everything that's happened here has happened on a spiritual foundation, and it has evolved into a political and economic structure. But the one other thing that we have on most cities, we don't tax the people for what we do. That dome didn't cost any taxpayer money. The airport doesn't cost any taxpayer money. The Gulch project is not going to cost any taxpayer money. We've used tax-exempt municipal bonds for the airport. And the airport generates $50 billion a year, but it doesn't cost the taxpayers any money. And I just realized that not many cities operate like we do. Right. But one city I found out that does, and I'm proud to be associated with them, and that is that San Francisco built the Golden Gate Bridge with tax-exempt municipal bonds. So they've been around for a long time, but not many cities have been willing to dream and then come up with the financing for whatever dreams they dream.
Please. Well, I was going to say for my mayors out here, if you ever want to feel inadequate as a mayor, sit at the feet of Ambassador Young. He is simply amazing, and it's such an honor to follow in his footsteps. And he mentioned the Gulch. The Gulch is a redevelopment in the heart of our city, but because of the legacy of the work of Dr. King's parents and Ambassador Young, even with this $5 billion redevelopment, we made sure that equity was the centerpiece. So there's $28 million set aside for affordable housing. There's a $12 million citywide economic development fund, and it goes on and on and on. So what we've tried to do in Atlanta and continuing this legacy is to make sure that as we grow and as we expand, that with the leadership of this great team, many of whom are here today, that we're making sure our communities aren't left behind. I see my COO and our head of our watershed department, Keisha Powell, on the front row. Even through our water department, we are now training prisoners in conjunction with our corrections department so that as they are transitioning out of their sentences, they are being trained for jobs in the city of Atlanta, full paying jobs. These are all men with families so that they can have benefits and all of the things that full-time employment has to offer. And so I'll simply say before I toss to Dr. King, for me, the standard really is what's my mom able to explain to her club members when they have their Bridge Club meeting on Saturday? We talk about these buzzwords, smart cities, equities. What does this mean to the common person? How do I explain it to my son's barber? And for us, it's just about creating an opportunity. And thank you, Aarti, for your vision and for bringing this great conference to Atlanta.
And I want to thank you, too, for bringing this to Atlanta. And I'm honored to be here with who I call Uncle Andy, and our mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms. I think that I don't like to look at things in terms of a broad stroke. And when you look at, you know, are we more or are we less compassionate? Because there's segments of people that are more compassionate, and there's segments of people that aren't. But when you look at things from a holistic perspective, what I first want to appreciate is the efforts of our mayor with the whole One Atlanta, because in many respects, I think we have done well, but I think that we've dropped the ball with some things, and people have been left behind. And so now there's an effort to ensure that we are becoming more inclusive as a city. You know, when I think about compassion, I think about, you know, that urgency to really feel the need to alleviate inequities, and really being diligent about that and intentional about that. And it's a balancing act when you're talking about progressing a city from a technological perspective and also progressing from what I would call a moral and spiritual perspective. And my father actually spoke to it in '67. And I wish we had listened when he spoke about it and wrote about it in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos of Community. He talked about the great chasm between our scientific and our technological advancement and our moral and our spiritual progress, and how we needed to bridge that lag. And one of the things he challenged us, which I think is the way that we get there, is that we have to have a revolution of values where people are at the center of our decision making, that we're really thinking about all of the people who will be impacted and affected by the decisions that we make, and literally all people that are impacted by it. And so he said we must rapidly, he said this in '67, we must rapidly begin a shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-centered society. And I wanted to share something because I thought it was so powerful. I know a lot of his quotes, but this one is a little bit much. But he said, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. So it really is about us being more concerned about people than even technology. I think we have been so driven by technology.
Right.
And I'm glad that, you know, smart cities and the whole concept of expanding the definition now includes the fact that we have to find a way to make sure that we don't leave people out of the equation, that we do consider those things such as justice and equity.
So earlier today,
Let me just
please.
say, I don't want to. I mean, Atlanta decided just about the time that your father made that speech that it was going to be a city too busy to hate. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the decisions we have made socially, economically, and politically, the mayor glossed over, and we call it affordable housing. And that doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people. But what it means to me is housing for teachers, housing for police officers, housing for nurses. We have one of the most dynamic health centers within walking distance of downtown Atlanta with Grady and Emory. And to have doctors and nurses be able to walk to work as a result of this. And normally, nurses can't afford, or teachers can't afford to live in a fabulous building like that. But everything we've done since the early '60s we've done on an inclusive basis, and it wouldn't have been done otherwise.
I just wanted to add from a smart city perspective, you know, we have the privilege of hearing extraordinary stories from around the world. A doctor here who will be here tomorrow from NYU Langone had done a study in 5 different cities and looked at the health of the population, affordable housing, transportation, and in Providence realized that they had a high rate of absenteeism in their schools. And so the mayor ended up putting washing machines in the public schools so people had dignity and would come to school and didn't have shame. And so that's how we're looking at smart cities and how we're leading. And Mayor Bottoms, you brought up the great example of you have been leading with compassion. And Commissioner Powell, not only did you talk about your program today, but your Chief of Corrections also talked about the program today. And how do we get people to understand that leading with compassion actually yields economic prosperity, right? Because lack of compassion has led to mass incarceration, institutional racism, generational poverty. And if only 3% of the world's architects are Black, think about who's designing our cities too. And so it's important for us to empower the right people, but you have been leading and letting everyone know that with compassion, we can have economic growth. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, Dr. King, of course, spoke of this beloved community, and my thoughts on that are, I guess, a bit different. For me, it really was, what was this city for me when my family struggled? And for me, I've shared the story publicly many times of my father's incarceration. My father was a well-known entertainer in the 1960s and ultimately ended up going to prison for selling drugs. And there were people like Ambassador Young, who I was able to look to, who at that time, even Ambassador Young, your wife had started the Dream Jamboree. That was a big event where the Atlanta public school students could go and get information about college. Well, that's so important, or was so important to me, and even opportunities like that are still so important today, because I had a group of young men from Atlanta Public Schools in my office yesterday as we relaunched My Brother's Keeper. And the question was asked, what, if you were mayor, what would you do on behalf of our communities? And almost every young man in that class said, I would expose us to more. Meaning, I would show us something outside of our communities. I would show us that there are other opportunities, that there are things that we may not otherwise know about. Growing up in Atlanta, it was looking at people like Ambassador Young, who I would see in the grocery store, you would see at the YMCA, knowing this too can be me. And so as I've had the opportunity to assemble such a great team of leaders in my cabinet, even Gary Brantley, our CIO, who during our interview talked about taking technology and not just what we do in-house in the city of Atlanta, but creating opportunities in our communities so our residents can access technology, be educated about technology. And I think that's really what it's all about. What we know as elected officials, our time is limited. But it really is, what do we leave for our communities? What do we leave for the future? Ambassador Young left so many tools for us to continue to build on. And now we just have to take this opportunity with the leadership and partnership with people like you, Aarti, and all of you all who are represented here today, and make a difference in our communities. And I'll end with this before I toss it back. I was a judge for several years, and what always struck me is that the vast majority of men, I would even say 95 to 99% on any given week, who came into my courtroom didn't have a high school diploma. Most had dropped out by 9th grade. So my belief as mayor is we will either pay on the front end or we will pay on the back end. So why not put our investment and our resources into making sure our kids in our communities have opportunities, then have to deal with it on the back end with high crime rates and the price that we have to all pay for mass incarceration.
Thank you. I didn't know. No, I just wanted to, for us, now that we look forward, how do we foster in underserved communities and marginalized communities? Like, how do we bring them up? How do we invest in coding programs? And like you said, let people can only be what they can see, and that's what you've been explaining. Dr. King, I know that you have a coding program. Is that correct?
Not quite.
Oh, not right. Oh, okay, not okay. So
You're working on it.
Oh, you're working on it. Okay. So yes, I just know that all three of you have been really focused on making sure that underserved, marginalized communities have the access and the tools to new technologies, and we able to move into the 21st century.
But, I think we're in the stage now where we really need to get the spiritual undergirding of the dynamic future of smart cities. that we've got the values pretty much right here, but statewide that's not true. Nationally, it's not true. But it takes almost a 60% majority to make political change. And technology can be developed by, three guys in a garage. You can have medical progress with a small laboratory. It doesn't have to be all that rich. It just has to be dedicated, and there are phenomenal things coming out in medical laboratories. And we are moving. I mean, it's going to take a long time for the politics to catch up with the technology. I mean, you got half the people, well, I don't want to talk about the Congress or the politics. We know that we have never waited in Atlanta, and cities can't wait for political change.
Right.
Before I got to be mayor, I picked up a book, Cities and the Wealth of Nations. And basically it says that nations don't develop wealth, cities develop wealth. And cities have problems, and cities develop solutions to their problems, and they export those solutions. And they use as an example Japan cities having not enough iron ore to make bicycles. And so they started experimenting with what metals they had in ceramics, and they ended up making a lightweight tubing, bicycle tubing, that was lighter than steel, stronger than steel and lighter than ceramics. And that one invention ended up creating the automobile industry in Japan that ended up taking 30% of our automobile manufacturing, simply because it was lighter, more efficient, but it came out of the problems. And so I've always seen Atlanta as a place that would embrace its problems and turn them into opportunities. And so, and that's happened. The kids at Bankhead used to be the roughest little neighborhood in town, but it gave rise to the rap industry, and most of the kids who were little thugs, 25 years ago, are millionaires now. And they created a whole rap industry and record industry. What are the figures now? $11 billion in movies around Atlanta. And it's kids from Atlanta. Now, they don't show up in the statistics. See, but your daddy said there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. We never worried about what the statistics were. You do what's right. And that's been the way this city has gone. And it's been willing to take risks, and it's been willing to, they sued me for wanting to build an international terminal. And they hired a big group of experts to prove that we did not need an international terminal. And by the time they came back with their conclusions, I had signed up Air France KLM and Lufthansa and Japan Air, and we brought in 1,000 companies from around the world through that international airport. But you don't you don't pay any attention to the status quo or statistics or the conventional wisdom. It's almost always dumb.
So I wanted to mention, although we don't have coding, I do have a dream, if I can say that. No pun intended.
If anybody gets to say it, you do.
Yeah. So we do a camp every year at the King Center. And one of my hopes and dreams is that we can develop a cadre of young people who understand my father's nonviolent philosophy and methodology and translate that, if you're talking about the spiritual foundation, into technology, nonviolent technology that really helps to create more equity and more inclusion. And so that's what you're talking about. We're in the infancy of that. But I think it's so important because I think the more people, and I don't think we ever need another Martin Luther King Jr., but I do think we need people who thought like him, who were grounded like him. And I would dare say, who saw the world the way he did. He understood our interconnectedness and our interrelatedness. He understood that I can't be all that I ought be until you all that you ought be, because we're caught in this inescapable network of mutuality and tied in this single garment of destiny. He understood that in order for us to create this beloved community, for him, the avenue was through nonviolence. And so our goal, our mission at the King Center is to develop as many people as we can in the foundation of those teachings and let, as we know, young people, they can conjure up a lot of stuff. They can dream up many things. They're very creative and innovative. But we need to make sure that they're grounded as they are developing all of these different platforms that can help us to address a lot of the inequities that we see right now in our society.
And something that struck me just as we're sitting here talking, on this property used to be an African-American community, a working class community called Lightning. And on the backside of this property was where my great-grandmother had a home. And this was a woman who, by all accounts, is pretty feisty, so I think I get that from her. And she would walk down the street and lift up her dress and tell people to kiss her, you know what.
Oh, my.
So I got a little piece of that, too, sometimes, Ambassador Young. But as I sit here, it just strikes me what this city is and what it can be. And for my great-grandmother, who came out of the cotton fields in East Georgia, to now have me sitting here as mayor, I think really is all that we can hope our cities to be. From
no question.
My friends are here, Mayor of Honolulu, Mayor of Augusta. We're all dealing with the same issues and challenges and opportunities in our cities. And whether it's like Honolulu, who's facing literally its existence because of climate change, or what Mayor Davis is dealing with in Augusta as you're dealing with growth and how do you keep your city affordable, it's not any different in any of our cities. And I think that's why it's important that we continue to gather and share ideas and make sure that for my grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, that those same opportunities and even more are available to them.
But we're in problems because when I was mayor, it hadn't been that long ago, we were just 1 million people. You got 6.5 million to deal with. And people said we still have the largest number of poor people. Yeah, but they weren't born here. They came here from somewhere else. Because the people who were in our projects when I was mayor, I was with 6 of them out in Buckhead the other night, and it was the biggest house I'd been in Buckhead. And I said, where did you all come from? All of them went to Atlanta Public Schools. All of them went to Georgia Tech or Georgia State or at Morehouse, and they went to graduate schools, and they started working. Well, it was 1966 when cities were rioting, and Atlanta decided they didn't want riots. So there were 6 black CEOs and 6 white CEOs. 12 of them that used to get together on Saturday morning. And they decided they were going to create summer jobs and have a summer youth program. So they got on the phone, and in 10 days, they created 6,000 summer jobs that kids who had been hanging on the corner had to put on a shirt and tie and go to work in all of these corporations around here. Most of those kids stayed in those corporations. And those corporations are profitable because of the energy and vitality. One I talk about is, well, let me just go to Africa right quick, because 3 billion people will be on the African continent pretty soon. And that's 1/3 of the world's population. And there are very few companies that have any marketing power to deal with an African market of 3 billion. The one company that does is Coca-Cola. And that's because a fellow by the name of Carl Ware, who grew up, really he wasn't a city boy, he was a country boy from Noonan. But he went to our schools, and he ended up taking the street smarts and the education that he accumulated in this community, and he took on a problem for Coca-Cola where when everybody else was moving out and running from apartheid, he went in and sold the Coca-Cola bottling company to South African breweries, which just happened to be owned by 5 young black men who went to a college called Adams College, which was founded about the same time Morehouse and Spelman were founded. And so having those kind of global connections mean that Coca-Cola is ready to do business all over the world. But it wouldn't have been that way if it hadn't been for the integrating the drive and the wisdom and the courage of people who were born poor. They weren't born dumb. In fact, being born poor is a real advantage. You grow up with a certain toughness, and I thank God that my public school was called a bucket of blood, but I didn't grow up here. I'd have been a better student if I'd been here. But New Orleans was rough when I was growing up. But that's where I learned my street lessons. And if you could get along at Belina C. Jones School, I can get along with any leader anywhere in the world. And the values that come, I mean, we ought not look down on our kids or your father. I mean, he was ahead of his time. He shouldn't have been in jail. He had an opioid crisis. And that's what white folks have at this time. But the pressure on him was not just the drug problem. The pressure was that he was a smart man who wanted to control his own records and maintain control of his own music. That's the reason he and Ray Charles and who was it? Brown, Augusta, James Brown. That's the reason they got arrested. It wasn't the fact that they were drug users. They were demanding the rights to their businesses. So let's don't look down on our folk too much.
Well, I know that we can continue this conversation all evening. I know everyone else here is equally enamored by all of you as I am. I know that Mayor Bottoms, you have some things that you need to get to, and I want to thank you all for your time today. If you have some closing remarks, we'd love for you to share them. But this has really been an honor to have you all here.
Again, I'm grateful that you all are in Atlanta, and it really is my hope that our communities will be different because you've spent time here. this is what it's all about. It's about us continuing to grow and continuing to share, because so many issues that we are facing on a national and a global level, we really can't look to national and global leadership in the way that we once did. We really, we are in control of our fate, and it's our future to make better. So thank you.
And I want to thank you as well, and take this opportunity to invite you to come to the King Center on Auburn Avenue and be inspired to continue to do this great work. I also want to encourage each one of you to understand that you were born as a solution to a problem and an answer to a question. And that as you leave here, that you not just take this as good information, but this has to be spread out, because the reality is, in order for us to create these compassionate cities, it's going to take more than elected officials and what we call leaders. It's going to take everyday citizens being a part of it and pulling their load, making their voice be heard, being at the table of decision making as well. I mean, we are a beloved community, and without everyone's participation, and I mean active participation, it makes it much more difficult for us to create the just, humane, and peaceful world. And so I just encourage you to do your part in taking it to the next level and making sure that there are others who benefit from what you have learned during this entire expo.
I think that we got this problem licked already, because you all decided you're going to keep coming back here till 2026 or sometime. That this is going to be a regular occurrence. And just walking from the street here, I met somebody that knows how to make trees that convert the carbon dioxide in the air to oxygen and water. And I met some other folk that are doing DNA analysis for disease prevention. And I met another young lady who's saying that her daughter is writing a book on from teens to titans. And we got smart cities of the world right here in this room. And as you keep coming back here and we keep working on these things together, this is a tremendous opportunity. And I thank you for coming, and I thank you for bringing this convention here. We are the leader in conventions in this nation, I believe, in the world now. So lots of things happen here, and whenever you get a chance to come back, come on back and enjoy it. Share the wisdom you have with us and see what we're doing also.
And thank you to FIAR Barcelona for choosing Atlanta. Thank you.
Thank you all.